welcome back to Talking Pictures. I'm Mary Stack.
I'm Michael Dow.
And we're catching up on a rich few weeks of movies. Casting an eye on several films today, including a couple we caught on Netflix. And so the rundown's going to be, first, The Sun Is Also a Star, The Mustang, Wild Nights with Emily, Bathtubs Over Broadway, Red Joan, and Tolkien. So, Mike, why don't you start us off with The Sun Is Also a Star?
Yeah, kind of get that one out of the way, I suppose. Well, Sun Is Also a Star is a film that caught my eye because it has a very interesting premise. It's about two teenagers living in New York City. One is African American, and her family is Jamaican, and they're on the verge of being deported. While the boy love interest is South Korean, and his family's forcing him to go to Dartmouth to be a doctor. And there are greater conflicts I can imagine in life, but whatever.
It's
so anyway,
believable, though.
yeah, well, yeah, sure, to a degree. So what happens is these two characters kind of meet cute in New York City, and basically they have pretty much a day to get to know each other, fall in love, and all that. And it seems to be part of a cycle of a lot of kind of teenage movies these days, these kind of tragic films. But if you've seen 5 Feet Apart or The Fault in Our Stars, these films where one or two teenagers has a terminal illness and they're dealing with that, not really my kind of cup of tea subject matter. But this one really struck me as interesting because of the time element. They have a very limited amount of time. They have real world issues that they're both dealing with, and they're trying to discover each other within a matter of hours. So interesting premise. And again, part of the reason why it intrigued me was it seems to be inspired by an older movie, a Judy Garland, Robert Walker movie called The Clock, where he's a veteran on leave for the weekend and they fall in love. And it's the anxiety of time, the kind of pressure of time on both of the characters that I find fascinating, again, as a narrative premise. Unfortunately, the film really doesn't do all that much with it. And again, it's geared at an adolescent audience, so I'm kind of a little bit out of touch. I can't quite put my finger on why, but yeah. So the performances are hot and cold. The young woman in the film, Yara Shahidi, is phenomenal. The director kind of leaves her stranded, and she spends a little bit too much time in the film, kind of being a moony-eyed Zooey Deschanel type character. But you can see that the actress herself has tremendous potential, and the camera loves her, and she's fantastic. The male lead, played by Charles Melton, I guess he's famous for being on Glee, so I read, is extremely wooden and terrible. It's like he makes Keanu Reeves look like a Laurence Olivier type. He's really, really awful. But he's cute, so he's passable. So it's a film that, again, it's heavy-handed. It focuses a lot on fate and destiny. And you even have characters quoting, like the father in the morning says, tells her, it's like, be mindful of your destiny. He says something really heavy-handed like that.
Cookie.
Yeah, and she wears a jacket that says Deus Ex Machina on the back of it. And then we cut to the boy waking up in the morning and he just spontaneously scribbles in his notebook, Deus Ex Machina. So, and we're supposed to accept that as, oh, they belong together because they both have a similar thought. It's so ludicrous. Exactly. Yeah, it's way too easy. It's way too easy. But as I say, the premise is interesting. Shahidi is an interesting person to watch, I think, on the horizon. I hope they give her something a little more substantial to star in.
Watch out for her.
Yeah. So, but I thought I'd take a chance. I got a little burned, but it wasn't the worst film in the world.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, here's one that I loved, and it went, at the speed of light, which I don't understand why, because I think it's an amazing subject matter, The Mustang. It's very moving. It's about a convict played by Matthias Schoenhardt, who's one of my favorite actors. I think he's Belgian or Flemish. He's been in several big films. He's in a prison in rural Nevada, and they have a program where part of your social rehab is to work with horses. There's a horse farm attached to the prison. And he is struggling with a very angry and violent past. He's like a time bomb, this guy. And he does that terribly, terribly well. A lot of his first portion of the film is nonverbal. Okay. He won't talk to anybody. His daughter comes to visit him. He won't speak to her. The social worker comes to visit him. And he's almost like, making his own predicament way worse because of his non-communication. Anyway.
I'm sensing some horse therapy on the horizon.
Yeah,
here.
but it wasn't the Horse Whisperer. It wasn't corny. In fact, Bruce Dern plays this veteran, crusty old horse trainer who's dynamite.
He's had a renaissance, which is fantastic.
Unbelievable. Yeah, Star is Born. He was really good in that as well. Anyway, so
Not Star is Born. He was in The Hateful Eight. That was Sam Elliott.
Oh, right. Sam Elliott.
Another crusty,
Yeah.
like aging.
Anyway, it's a good wine from old bottles, right? Anyway, so in order to break this particularly bad horse, he's almost dared into breaking this one Mustang. He has to break himself down. I mean, not to sound a cliche, but that's actually what happens. He has to kind of dismantle his own psyche to understand the horse.
Okay.
And it's brilliant. It's beautifully shot. The woman that directed it and wrote it obviously had her own vision. There's she gets a little bit into her own head at points which are inaccessible, I felt, to the audience. Her name's Laura de Clermont-Tonnerre. I think she should shorten her name so people can remember, but anyway.
Americanize it a little bit?
Yeah. So it's very blurry at times, her vision. It really is. Particularly as there's a fire in the horse barn at one point, and it kind of gets like Apocalypse Now, a bit like that, you know.
Okay.
Anyway, I like the fact it wasn't a cliched happy ending. And at the end, they actually show the real convicts that are in this unit. So it's based in truth. And there's several states, apparently, in the Midwest that have this program. And they're very successful in giving guys, I mean, rather like when they bond with dogs in a dog training program, a sense of purpose, love, learning how to, emote and work with another living person.
And he would have,
creature.
he had responsibility for this one horse?
He first is doing general maintenance.
Okay.
And then they basically say, then nobody goes near this one horse because he's out of control.
Right.
So they say, I mean, it's almost a dare. They said, see if he can stay in 30 seconds in the arena with the horse.
Right.
So they put him in. So it's a dare. And he's pretty scared, but he won't back down.
Okay.
And it's great. It's a great film. And I again, I personally don't understand why it wasn't a great hit. I would have thought a lot of young people could really relate to this character.
Maybe it's too good, as usual.
Yeah. So, it's recommended. Briefly moving on to Wild Nights with Emily, another one that came and went at the speed of light. This is directed by another woman, Madeleine Olnek, who I don't know anything about. It mostly works, this film. It's clearly an independent movie shot on very little funds. And the reason why I say that, I like a lot of indie films. It's a historical drama, and it shows that it hasn't really been put together properly.
Okay.
It's a bit loose around the seams. And you can't do that with historical drama because it's glaring. However, Molly Shannon plays Emily Dickinson, which was a rather strange choice. And Susan Ziegler plays Susan, who is her sister-in-law. And they have this wild, torrid, lifelong love affair. In fact, the film suggests that they get together and marry, and so that they can be together. She marries her brother, Emily's brother, and then lives next door. So the beginning has a strange kind of tone, the film. It's like a Woody Allen comedy. It's a bit slapsticky, and you're not sure if you can take it seriously. So I think it has trouble settling into its mood. The latter part,
having anything to do with Molly Shannon and what she's known for, or is that just...
No, I think they take, because it's such a different view of Emily Dickinson, instead of this cloistered, reclusive, almost asexual poet, we've got this very wild and passionate woman.
Lusty.
Yeah, running across the garden every 5 minutes to have a session of a mad love with these crinolines on and all the rest of it. That's funny. That's actually funny. Okay. But I don't know how much of it is taking liberties.
Yeah.
Some of it is definitely true because I looked into it. And I think what is interesting is very few of her poems were published in her lifetime, like 11 or something. And the bulk of them, which is thousands, were published after she died, and mostly because Susan is mentioned in all of them. And
By
it wasn't
name?
until, they
interesting.
erased them, physically erased the name Susan out of her poems.
Yeah.
And this was only unearthed by the New Yorker a few years ago when they did some sort of, UV light on these samples, old samples, and saw this Susan was erased. So I felt that it was worth a view because the poems were so wild and scandalous, and they are indeed very passionate.
Especially when you have an understanding of the context.
Exactly. It wasn't all unrequited. It was very real.
Yeah.
And she was very progressive. So worth a view. So what a segue on to your next movie, Michael.
Well, always trying to think of like connections here, right?
Bathtubs?
Yeah, well, this idea of a hidden history, which I think is actually fascinating, and it makes you realize, or it just made me wonder, at least in the general sense of like, how much is there that's kind of like right there, just under the surface historically, that we don't even know about? Certain quirky,
like the Green Book.
Yeah, well, that, or any kind of cultural phenomenon that occurs that is forgotten in some curious way. Anyway, so I saw this movie. It's on Netflix, and it has an unfortunate title, a couple of unfortunate qualities to it, which I will get to, but it's called Bathtubs Over Broadway, and it's a documentary. It's pretty much a passion project by a guy named Steve Young, who was I guess he may have been the head writer. He was the longest lasting writer for the David Letterman show for late night. And so really interesting guy, and he's the central figure in this documentary. And his passion was collecting these records. Okay, before I describe the records, I have to back up a little bit. Okay, and believe me, all this is interconnected. So I guess there was this phenomenon ranging from the 50s up until the 1980s where companies or corporations would, as we know, kind of put on conventions for their employees. And so you would go to this convention as a manager or whatnot, and you'd have to sit through a number of kind of boring speeches and lectures about how the company's doing, where it's heading, the prospects for its future, blah, blah, blah. And then they would treat the audience to these very extravagant musical theater productions. And these productions would be composed by these quite ingenious composers, and the musicals would sing the praises of the product, okay? So you'd have musicals about silicone, for example, or you'd have musicals put on by GE, the wonders of electricity and that kind of thing. And I guess all of these companies did this. I mean, there were thousands of productions over this 40-year or so time period.
So there was an industry of the people, like jingle writers, that just did
Exactly.
this?
They were like these industrial musical theater productions, okay? And people loved it. I mean, it's a term, I don't know if it translates in other cultures, but American corporate culture was all about boosterism. This idea of really selling the brand, making the brand a kind of lifestyle, not just for the consumer, but for the employees as well. And so these productions would often sing the praises of management. You're doing a swell job. Keep up the great work. We love you. The corporate honchos kind of delivering this message. But what's really interesting is that the film is as much about that history, and there's a lot of footage of stage productions of these things, which is fascinating, kind of campy stuff. But then it also gets into the kind of collector mentality, and the film goes really out of its way to try to demonstrate here is this kind of this arcana that is forgotten, that is so worthy of rediscovery and is as deserving in reputation of the musicals that we all are overly familiar with by this point. So it's a really interesting take on again a kind of subculture.
Yeah,
okay,
really
again
is.
a kind of literal hidden history. It's really, really interesting. And as I say, it's campy, it's hilarious, it's funny.
And also discipline when you think about it. I mean, when you have to write sitcoms to a certain number of minutes, these guys had to put together this thing.
It really is. I mean, it kind of forces you in some ways to kind of challenge your notions, or let's say what we consider to be the conventions of a given art form. It really expands the parameter in that regard. And what he does is, Steve Young goes out of his way. First of all, he interviews a couple of record collectors and the lengths they go to find these records. But then he unearths a number of composers, a number of stars of these shows, and kind of gives them a second wind and gives them a belated praise. It's really nice and touching. A couple of issues is the film's a little bit too much about Steve Young and the obsessiveness of record collecting. And believe me, I get it. I know what that is.
A little bit of a mania there, I'd say.
But so that's a bit of a limitation of the documentary. But as a form of outsider music, it's really excellent. And there's one particular album that is especially notorious. It's called The Bathrooms Are Coming. It's the most notorious industrial souvenir record ever made. And so if anybody finds this the least bit curious, I would highly recommend they YouTube it or Google it or whatever, because again, it's a very kind of out there, fringe quality of popular culture. Yeah. So as I say, for the subject matter alone, I can't recommend it highly enough.
Great. Yeah. Well, you're right about stumbling on things, by chance sometimes on Netflix, because there is such a great variety of different genres there now.
Yeah.
I mean, you could actually spend all day, every day just watching.
Yeah, that's why I think we need to pay, give a little bit of a kind of due to Netflix here.
So one point in case, I actually stumbled on this movie called A Little Chaos last week. Never heard of it, knew nothing about it, and I love both Kate Winslet and Alan Rickman. Yeah. Alan Rickman's one of my favorite actors. And, I've seen those two together in Sense and Sensibility, and they were marvelous together. Anyway, this particular film, subject matter is great. It's about the building of the gardens in Versailles, under Louis XV. And Alan Rickman wrote it, directed it, and actually stars in it, which is pretty amazing. And it's a period piece, exquisitely done on every level. Just think about how you would reconstruct, and deconstruct building a garden.
Right.
And she's responsible for the water part of the garden, which is a water exhibit, which is a massive amount of planning.
And do they really focus on the material details of putting it together?
They do some.
I can imagine what kind of budget they must have needed.
She presents her plans.
Okay.
And here's the other thing, I'm just saying in passing.
Yeah.
The guy that's really one of the biggest draws for me in the film is Matthias Schoenhardt, again, who we just mentioned in Mustang. You will not believe this is the same man. This guy is such an incredible actor. Not just his voice and his whole demeanor, but his physical body is so different, subdued and introverted in this film. If you see them back to back, you'll be really, I think, amazed at the range of this guy's talents. So there we are. I would strongly recommend that. On to another movie. There's been a whole slew of films shot lately about the wars.
Never mind these period pieces that we keep
relying
on.
And one is Red Joan, which just came out with Judi Dench. This is a period that most people are familiar with in the 30s, where Cambridge seemed to spawn a whole batch of communists, very inspired, bright young men generally. But here she is, a physicist in a very sexist environment, studying, and she gets caught up with this very dashing young man. I'm not quite sure what his background is. He has an accent. I don't know if he's German, but his name is Leo. He's played by Tom Hughes, who plays in Victoria. If anyone's been watching Victoria, he plays Albert very, very well. Anyway, she gets completely caught up with this guy. He's very charismatic and very political. And there's a lot of idealism and confusion at that time about where people should be putting their energies. And then all of a sudden, Joan discovers that her work is really to do with the bomb. I mean, she knows they're building a bomb, but she doesn't know what's happening with the bomb. She signs the Official Secrets Act. Anyway, long story is she starts spying, not officially for the Russians, but through Leo and Leo's contacts. She hears and sees the footage about Nagasaki and is so horrified that, like 75,000 people have instantly been destroyed, not to mention the aftermath.
Right.
That she says the only way to balance the forces of evil is to equip both sides with the information. And so she's a total patriot to the end. She says she totally loves her country. She wanted to diffuse future world wars. So by giving the information to the Russians, it would create a stalemate. And indeed it has. It has created this for a long period in history, which is part of her argument. When she's arrested, Judi Dench actually doesn't play a great big role in the film in terms of the footage.
She's just become a name now.
She's so good and she's so underused. That's probably my only criticism of the film.
Okay.
That she really has a lot to say about that line of idealism versus patriotism versus politics. That whole labyrinth is a really interesting combination, this woman. And suddenly we discover this widow living in suburbia who's arrested by, MI5 and the Secret Service, and they say, we've got this information. They find this huge file. and she's tried as a spy, and her son defends her. They don't cover the court case, they just tell you at the end she never serves any time. But she does have to convince her own son that she did it for the right reasons, because he said, "You're a traitor. I'm not having anything to do with you."
Well, the political winds had shifted so radically, yeah.
So it's really worth seeing, because her impact was actually quite remarkable, immeasurable perhaps, and I never heard anything about this woman.
So another hidden history.
And another woman, I have
theme.
to say, rather like I just saw a play on the, Rosalind Franklin, the woman that first saw the DNA double helix, who was another crystallographer studying at Cambridge, who completely got overshadowed in the Nobel Prize. So there were actually very bright women. I think this is what's coming out a lot in these films.
Yeah.
Working at NASA.
Hidden Figures.
Yeah.
That was the,
Yeah. So, and this was a very brave act on her part. She was very scared about doing it, but she felt really that this was her duty to stop further destruction on this kind of awful, horrendous global scale.
Yeah.
So it's really worth seeing for the subject matter, because it asks a lot of good questions of you. Where does your real fidelity and affinity lie?
Yeah.
In terms of doing the right
Never
thing.
mind that, yeah, exactly. And are you doing the right thing?
Yeah, are you doing the right
that
thing?
sense of existential doubt.
So, on to another war-y kind of film, a bit.
Another period piece.
Yes. Tolkien.
Yes.
So, Mike, you start us off.
It's directed by Dome. I guess his name's Dome. Karakowski. Well, he did Tom of Finland, which is on my watch list for some reason. And it stars Nicholas Hoult and Mimi Keene, neither of whom I'd heard of.
Superb.
Yeah, well, I liked him very much. Yeah.
I thought they were both brilliant.
Yeah, well, her role is, well, we can talk about that in a minute. But
he's definitely someone to watch, though.
Yeah, but the film covers, I guess you could say, 3 general periods in J.R.R. Tolkien's life prior to his actual publishing of The Hobbit and the subsequent.
Rings,
exactly. So it gets into his prehistory, and the film has to walk a kind of delicate line between being a kind of conventional period piece in the manner that you were speaking of, what a period piece needs to be and historical drama needs to do and needs to be, something we should probably talk about, because I'm curious what your take on that is. But it does that quite effectively, and that's where I found it most interesting, is the extent to which it captures the prehistory of Tolkien as a kind of folk pop hero, and it doesn't overplay the, where did all the influence for the novels come from? It doesn't overplay that too much, which I liked. It hints at that maybe even a little too much, but it really focuses on the traumas of the prehistory of those books. So basically it goes through his childhood, it focuses on his experiences in World War I, and what I found rather daring was that it focuses on a singular moment. When he's in the trenches in the Somme in France, and that kind of triggers a flashback narrative structure where we then go back to his childhood, and then we visit his relationship with his muse, which I don't know what you thought. I thought that was the weakest part, the relationship actually with his subsequent wife, Edith Bratt, right? I found that was, in some respects, the weakest part. But anyway, it covers a lot of terrain, and as I say, without really going into the period where he actually sits down and does the laborious task of writing the novels that we know him for. So it's really interesting to look at the prehistory. And one of the things I did look up, the kind of details of his earlier life. And the film goes out of its way to, I think, authentically recreate moments that seem to be very minor, but subsequently had a great impact on his work as a writer.
So here's the 2 big criticisms I read about it, which I don't totally share. One is the family have disowned the film. They've had nothing to do with it and say it's not an accurate depiction of his life and influences. Particularly one major thing, which is religion, in the same way that C.S. Lewis had this deep, deep love affair, hate with the Catholic Church through his life, being an atheist, then being a believer and what have you. Tolkien also was a deeply religious person. That doesn't come across in the film. at all. You see his relationship, which is somewhat strained with the priest that takes him in.
And the church misleads him, sends him on a path
Yeah.
to war.
Yeah.
Recommends that he kind of delay his romance with.
Yes, well, the man. I don't know if it's the church. The man.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
of course, but what does the priest represent? I mean, the church has a voice in the film.
But that he stays very good friends with him, and that is not really made as clear in the film that was a pivotal influence.
Yeah, and the priest comes back at the end of the film. It's like, oh, that guy. It's strange because he disappears. Yeah.
Colomini. I thought Colomini.
Right.
But anyway, so I mean, if there is that, there is obviously always going to be a school in any biographical kind of piece of how true or accurate certain things are. But overall, considering, as you say, the complexity of the amount of material they had to cover, I thought the way they shot the trenches was superb, absolutely superb. When you think about, we talked about that film a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, They Shall Not Grow Old. Yeah, it's similar in a way.
I mean, it really echoed it so brilliantly.
It's just when he has the fantastic visions on the battlefield, I thought was maybe a bit much.
Well, I don't know if they were visions. I think the guy was very ill, maybe delirious, had got mustard gas poisoning at various stages. He's got mustard gas. He pulls on a mask, takes it off, pulls it on. Yep. So, you're amazed he survives. Yeah. Because, if it wasn't for his dear...
through a series of lucky happenstance,
lucky
right? And the relationships were interesting. I found the relationship.
And it shatters the fellowship, which is the interesting thing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the relationship with Edith, I didn't find entirely convincing. There's a bit of business where he takes her to see the ring cycle, and they can't get tickets because he's too poor. So they hang out kind of backstage, and they play with I don't know.
I don't know if it happened, but I loved it because I think to me, that's the thing that really worked. Was both of those people were orphaned, thrown together, and they survived through their imagination. Mm-hmm. She through music, but he through language, and I thought that was the thing that bonded them.
That's fine, but the film still presents her a little bit too much as this kind of ethereal muse figure.
Well, she was. Well, she actually ended up being.
Which I understand, and that's, but then at the same time, the film kind of puts a couple of awkward feminist lines in her mouth, I have an inner life too. She gives that speech to him. She's, I'm stuck playing the sentimental music. I want to be an artist too. It kind of gives, and then near the end, when he starts actually writing, and she says, "You're neglecting your family," and those were a little.
You catch up on things sometimes.
A little at odds with how we're supposed to be left with her and her influence on him. Again, not a major thing, but a little bit annoying. Whereas the relationship actually with his friend Jeffrey Smith, the boy who has. Poet who actually, as we discover late in the film, has a kind of unrequited attraction to Tolkien, which the film, I think, deals with quite well. So that relationship, as minor as it is relative to his relationship with Edith, I found actually to be more effective. But
whatever the differences we have on it, I think we both agree it was a really powerful film.
Well worth seeing.
Definitely worth seeing.
Yeah, and I think, as we've alluded to a couple times with all these historical dramas that we've caught up on, it's my biggest problem always going to these films, no matter the subject matter, is it's okay, how much can I trust? How much can I really believe? How can I, especially we've been burned so many, you like Green Book and, Bohemian Rhapsody, these films that really manipulate and mutilate the truth. This one really seems to at least try to capture something authentic.
And the magic actually was inherent in the actual substance without any special effects, particularly, and I liked that.
The first third for me was the best, where his mother puts on the show and she reads Beowulf to him and his brother, and and the relationship with the woman who played the mother. I wanted so much more of that.
She was very interesting.
It's fantastic. So a lot to recommend there.
So stay tuned. I think that's all we have to say for today, Mike.
Yeah, which is plenty.
So goodbye from Mary Stack.
And from Michael Dow. Take care.